Hi, everybody. We're just going to give another minute or so for people to sign on and join us. So I'm just going to give another minute, and then we'll do an intro and welcome. Okay, let's get started. It looks like people are successfully signing on, so that's exciting. Welcome to everyone who's attending this webinar panel opportunity, and thanks for our panelists for joining us today. My name is Kelly Blank, and I'm a current faculty for the School of Social Work, and I teach in the OCL macro practice, but I also work for continuing education, so we work together to do webinars and seminars like this online. So we are kind of accustomed to doing this, and so that's why we were asked to pull this together. But you may or may not know, this is kind of the first time we're holding this type of forum to discuss benefits and opportunities available in OCL macro social work practice. And we know that we get lots of questions from not just students, but professionals too, about what's out there, what are some opportunities for me if I do choose to study kind of an OCL macro practice, or if I'm working in that right now. And so we'd like to make this kind of an ongoing opportunity in the future to help answer some of those questions for students and professionals. So if you have questions actually during this webinar, we have everyone on mute except for our panelists, but if you have questions, there's a Q&A box where you can type us questions and we can try to answer those throughout the webinar, but we'll also allow for some time at the end to do some open Q&A. So I'm going to try to incorporate those as we can and also allow for some open time. So I'd like to introduce our panelists. We have 4 panelists today. Oh, actually, we're going to do some housekeeping before we do that. In order, like I said, in order to interact with me, if you can use the Q&A box, that's helpful. We are recording this webinar, and because you're in audio listen mode, we're recording it, so the only thing that you'll hear is us talking as part of this panel, but we're going to have that edited and ready to share to our listservs very soon. So you'll be able to access that, or if people missed it today and you know someone that might want to view it, we'll have that available. You can change the size of the video in the top right-hand corner, and if you're having tech problems, you can't hear us or anything like that, you can call one of these numbers and they can kind of help you through it. Sometimes that happens. So I want to introduce our panelists. We have 4 panelists today, and we kind of chose some people that have a lot of experience in a lot of different unique macro level social work practice. So I'm going to just quickly introduce, and then I'm going to allow them to introduce themselves and kind of some of the experience that they bring to the table today. So the first panelist is Janlynn Miller. She's Director of Constituent Services for the Office of Senator Stephanie Chang. Our second panelist is Jameca Patrick-Singleton, Chief Recovery Officer for the City of Flint. Our third panelist is Kadi Prout, Director of Child Welfare Policy with the Michigan Federation for Children and Families, and she also works with us on a special grant with the school as well. And then Bob Sheehan, CEO of Community Mental Health Association of Michigan. So maybe, Janlynn, you could tell us a little bit about your experience so far to date.
Well, hello, everyone, and thank you for having me. So as Kelly explained, I am the Director of Constituent Services for Senator Stephanie Chang. I've been with her for, well, let me back up a little bit. I had the opportunity to intern for her when I was sitting in the same chairs you're sitting in now as students. And she was a state rep at the time. And over the past election in November of 2018, we ran for the Senate and won. So it's been a bit of a transition, but my role hasn't really changed, just broadened as our territory has gotten bigger. Mm-hmm. But I do a lot of work here in Detroit. I try not to do Lansing. So legislatively, I have a little bit of knowledge of what's going on, but that's not really my role. My role is to take care of the constituents here in her district. And, you know, people ask me all the time, well, what do you do? And I said, well, when someone says, call your city councilwoman or call your city or your state congressman or whatever, people do that. And I'm the one that kind of fields those calls and those emails. And sometimes it's just a matter of providing a phone number and a resource. Sometimes it's actually taking on a role of being a case manager and advocating for certain situations. Medicaid, Medicare benefits are some of the biggest things that we get hit with in our office here in Detroit. Immigration, we serve the Southwest Detroit population, which is one of the largest immigration populations in the state. So we do work a lot on immigration supports, where we might write letters of support for folks that have been detained by ICE. So we just do a lot of work with constituents from A to Z. Whatever their issue is, if we don't have an answer, we find it. And then aside from that, we do some community organizing. We meet with a lot of the neighborhood block clubs and associations and help them form or try and get their mission rolling. And I do a lot of event planning here. So we try to do town halls, convene monthly discussions, roundtables with certain groups. So a little bit of everything.
It sounds like it. Oh my goodness.
I also have the opportunity to supervise interns, and we do take Michigan State interns, and I'm an alumni, as I mentioned, so yes. We're very biased, so send them our way.
Yes. Well, thanks for that. That's really helpful, because I didn't even know all of that about your background, so that's really great. How about Kadi? Kadi, would you provide a little bit of your background, please?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Thanks for having me this afternoon.
Sure.
I'm Kadi Prout, and I work at the Michigan Federation for Children and Families. My position currently is the Director of Child Welfare Policy. So if you're not familiar with the Federation, we're a membership association, a nonprofit organization, and we represent 53 member agencies who are all private nonprofit organizations that work in contract throughout the state with the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services. And our member agencies provide services in the areas of family preservation, foster care, adoption work, community behavioral health services, and residential treatment as well, the full array of child welfare services. So the Federation is an organization where private agencies become members of ours, and we work with them in navigating a lot of the different systems, state government, legislature, and we provide a collective voice on their behalf. I have been at the Federation for almost 10 years now, and in my role as Director of Child Welfare Policy, I work with our members who, after listening to Janlynn, is a little bit like my constituents, and we respond to all of their needs, help them navigate different questions related to implementation of policy, advocating for changes in legislation, developing legislation, changes in statute, ultimately to help achieve the best outcomes for kids and families who are engaged with the child welfare system. So I do a lot of work in conducting policy analysis, researching different issues and how other states are operating their child welfare systems, creating advocacy tools, and working with our members to meet with their legislators, meet with different folks in state government who can help them in achieving their mission in serving kids and families.
Great. That's really interesting. I'm going to learn a lot today, I can tell. It's really interesting. I know a little bit about the Federation, but that was really helpful to understand kind of how the impact that you have there. So that's great. How about Jameca? Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Absolutely. Thanks for having me today. Well, I am also an alum of the Michigan State School of Social Work MSW program.
Yay!
Currently, I work as the Chief Recovery Officer for the City of Flint. I work out of the Mayor's office. And in this role, the main goal of this position is to help to transition the community from crisis to recovery. I think that most people are aware of the water crisis that Flint has gone through. And so my position was created to basically, we had a lot of here and now sort of crisis management that was taking place. So my position was created to, make those long-term impacts. to create opportunities for residents to be able to impact policy change, to make sure as we're moving forward, we're keeping the voice of residents in the forefront. Right now, we're working on a resident-driven recovery plan that, again, will ensure that recovery is in all policies at the City of Flint to make sure that we're creating systemic change that makes sense to people who live, work, and play in Flint. Just all of those policy things. We are creating a team for the first time ever. There will be like an outreach team right out of the mayor's office and make sure that people have access to resources. I like to describe it as making Flint whole. We know that this crisis, though the water, was kind of the boiling point, we had the economic crisis and so forth and so on. So just making sure that recovery is just all through, just woven through, the entirety of City Hall and city administration and the community as a whole.
That's great. And we know there's lots of good work going on there, and we even have you coming to talk about it, right? So we're excited to have you come and share, your journey and kind of the great work that's going on there. So that's going to be a really great workshop for us in continuing education, and thanks for doing that. Okay, Bob, how about you? Can you tell us a little bit about your background?
Sure. Currently, I'm the CEO of the Community Mental Health Association of Michigan. We're the statewide association that represents the public mental health system. That's all the 46 CMHs in the state, 10 publicly managed health plans, and then about 100 private providers that are in the CMH network. We do government relations. You heard a lot about that. We do policy development and analysis, do a lot of training, and then we do a lot of linking our members to policymakers. Prior to that, I was a CEO of a CMH for about 20 years. Prior to that, ran a small nonprofit that did runaway youth services in women's mental health and physical health. And then prior to that was a VISTA volunteer. So all macro practice since about the turn of the century, a couple of centuries ago.
Well, we appreciate all of the work that you do and also your support of the school and helping to educate students, because we also have Bob come in and do some teaching engagements for us, and it's really really well received and helpful. And I think it's helping students to make those decisions about where they want to work and what they want to specialize in. So, well, thanks to all of our panelists for kind of helping to get me up to speed on everyone's background as well. So the first question, we can kind of dive in. The first question that we had, and this is a pretty common question that I've received from students as well, is how do you become interested in macro social work? What is it even? And how did you know that macro social work was where you wanted to engage in practice? And I was really hoping that maybe, Bob, you might help us start the conversation there.
Sure. My path to social work took a lot of diversions, I guess. Really driven by, I must be sort of frank about the rage against injustice, against society crushes those who are vulnerable and voiceless. So it really came from that. And if I could jot down a couple of notes. And as I found myself leaning towards what field would that be where you can actually work on injustice, social work was what was there. It's community organizing, systemic change, organizational behavior fascinate me in terms of making things better, but always driven by social justice. A couple weeks ago, someone says, how'd you get in the mental health field? And I said, I'm really not in the mental health field. I've been doing it for 30 years, but I focus really on social justice and trying to overturn those injustices. So I think that's what motivated me to get into social work.
And that's really interesting. And I think that is something that drives people overall. And I think one of why this question was so important to students and other people that have asked us is because they often think that social work is only clinical, that clinical is the biggest focus, but it sounds like for you definitely found something else in social work that gave you passion and drive to move in your career.
Well, I enjoy clinical work, but it wore me out. And but macro does not. It just energizes me.
Yeah, I would agree with you there. What about some of our other panelists? Do you have anything to add to this question?
I would say that what motivated me to enter into the macro realm of social work was that early in my career, I did case management for people who were infected with HIV. And I also worked psych and substance abuse. And I would get really frustrated, particularly when I worked in HIV case management, in that it seemed to me that when we would have leadership change, like political leadership change, things would change. The way I was able to provide services to my clients would change. And that was very frustrating for me. And so I decided that I wanted to be involved in policy making and moving the community forward, at a macro level, and working to address those large population problems or issues at the same time, working towards injustice in that level. And so I was very fortunate in that almost immediately after starting graduate school, there was an opportunity to work in macro social work, and I was able to do that.
Did you start out clinical, Jameca, or you always knew you wanted to do macro?
I started out clinical. I was a teen mom, so when I entered social work, I wanted to work with teen moms. But this is social work, and my journey has kind of been, a little. Social work decided what it wanted to do with me.
That's right. I think everybody has their own journey story, right, for social work. But I would agree with you. I think that when I work with students too, is you have to still understand the big picture. Even if you're a clinician in a organization, you still need to look at the big picture of what's happening and be aware of what's happening at a legislative level, at a policy level, whether it's at the organization or at a state level, just to understand how that impacts either the services you're providing or even your job as an individual in that organization. So I think it's really important, and I agree with you, Jameca, that in order to really be even a good clinician, you should have that kind of background as well. Anybody else have any thoughts?
I declared, OCD as in grad school because I knew prior to going into grad school that I wanted to do macro social work.
Anybody?
I would like to chime in too.
Yeah.
So my background before working in an elected official's office was with the child welfare system with the state of Michigan as a foster care specialist. And day after day, policy changes, so many changes that you can't keep up with what's coming and what's going. And it creates high turnover. You're not really effective with your families that you work with. And so I decided I was just going to go back to school and get that extra $1 on the hour and go down to Lansing and make the policies myself. But it was my first class that was in public policy that made me realize I was containing myself to one agency or department to make changes in, and that becoming a macro social worker I could make changes in different areas all throughout the state. So that's why it was that very first class that I said, I'm going macro, and to kind of chime in and piggyback off of Rob. Clinical is tiring. It does wear you out. After 7 years of pushing really hard and trying to make changes for families and again, having your hands tied and not being able to really make effective change because of policy, it's tiring. It's very tiring.
It is. We don't practice very good self-care as social workers. So
no.
It is hard for sure. And I'm sure, Kadi, you can relate to the child welfare piece of the policy.
Yeah.
I'll just chime in here. I sense the theme of a lot of us having those clinical and micro level experiences that drove us to kind of frustration with the way systems are set up. And that really was my driving factor. That led me to become interested in macro social work. I had no idea that macro social work was a place for social workers to be operating in the field. But really my experience at that clinical level and being so frustrated at how we could serve families who were in such deep crisis and really needing assistance, and what we could do to help them was limited and restricted by certain policies. And that was frustrating. But then the next week, another family with a similar crisis was coming through the door, and we still only had the same resolution for them. It really led me to ask, what could we do to prevent that flow of these barriers that families have to experience in crisis, and look at broader systems changes.
For sure. Okay, I want to move on to the next question because there's some really important things that I want to make sure we get to, and since we only have a little bit of time. This question was something, again, that I hear in class oftentimes, and you may have gotten this from students you work with, but what are the best things about practicing macro social work, and then what are the challenges? And I was going to direct that at Kadi because I feel like there's a lot happening at your organization that you might feel, you might have some answers to that.
Yeah, so it's a great question. If you're going to dive into this field, you want to know what you're getting yourself into, right? So I think, in my opinion, one of the best things about macro social work is the ability to affect change, that you can really have as a social worker a really large scale intervention that can be really concrete and long lasting as well. We've talked about how it really is impossible to have services in place for social workers to have services at the micro level without political involvement. You have to be aware of what's going on the broader level, of what's going on in your legislature, what policies are being implemented by the departments that you work with that are impacting services. And so, in my position, I really get to help our members who do that really important day-to-day work with kids and families in the child welfare system to have a voice in those decisions in Lansing. And it drives me every day to come here to know that we're having that ability to have that broad scale impact with them. I will say that with that, I think it's also the greatest challenge too, that it really, in macro social work, systemic change takes time. That we can be aware that there are issues impacting kids and families, the ability to provide services, we can be aware of them, have data on it, be evaluating it, and it's going to take time for all the other stakeholders to come on board with you, to understand the issue in the same way that you do, and to reach a resolution together about how to create a change that's going to resolve whatever that systemic barrier is. So it's kind of the greatest opportunity and the greatest challenge at times to be patient and wait for all that important work to take place in a way that's going to create long-lasting impact.
I would totally agree with you. I think I worked on a lot of systems change efforts, and we talk about it being a marathon and not a sprint, and really being at the table with families and youth and direct consumers and helping them understand that as well, because you feel that compulsion to want to help right away, but sometimes those things take time, and so it is a challenge in that way, but it's also so gratifying to have that ability to work with families and youth and help them understand the processes to do that. What about Janlynn and Jameca? Do you have other ideas in this question?
Well, I just think some of the best things are just truly working with larger systems. As I mentioned, the clinical side was very tiring, and just being able to see how you can build that capacity, build relationships, make neighbors interact with one another that they've never even known their neighbor's name across the street, but by pulling together a town hall or some sort of roundtable discussion where everyone has something in common. I'm just building that leadership is one of the most rewarding things and the best things. And, sometimes the challenges to that or to this job, I think, are that we're sometimes running away from that clinical, but there are still individuals within the larger system where you find yourself still doing clinical work. So I think that would be the only challenge to working with communities. The mental health does not disappear just because we're community organizing or because we're advocating on one's behalf with something. So that is a big challenge to the work that I do as working with constituents.
Right, and keeping that awareness,
Yeah.
Of course, yep, for sure.
And the only thing that I would add is that because we're social workers, we know that when we're at the table, social work is at the table, and the social work perspective and keeping people first. Challenge is that most of the time, no one else at the table are social workers, so we always have to. We're reminding people of the bigger picture of why we're doing, the work that we're doing.
Okay, so that leads me right to the next question, Jameca, that I was going to direct at you, because you are in an area where you probably are at the table in kind of a non-traditional social work, and this is another question we get from students. I just, did a talk with some students about this with regard to when you're employed somewhere where you're the social worker and you have unique things that are, you bring to the job. How do you balance that, and what, unique skills do you have that you can share in that kind of non-traditional way?
So some of the unique skills, because we're social workers, we know how to look at situations, from that social work perspective. Sometimes we have to practice our skills, with other people, other professionals, and getting them to understand, again, those bigger pictures, and, putting people before policy and people before profit and things like that, and just constantly reiterating that. Also, we have to familiarize ourselves with, a little bit of the background of the other people. Again, when I'm talking to, say, for instance, a CFO, or the CFO for the city, one of the things that I often do is make sure that, when I'm setting the agenda, or when I'm speaking with him about a certain thing, making sure I'm making those connections. You know what, if we implement this program, it's going to help people, but this is also how it's going to, help you from your arena. So those types of things.
What about you, Janlynn? Because you're also kind of in a field where there's a lot of maybe non-social workers working.
Right. Yeah. So I feel like I'm constantly learning. When Jameca just mentioned, working with CFOs, I just immediately went to meetings with MDOT. Oh. They speak a totally different language than we do. So I'm there, I'm taking notes, but I have to come back and learn what it was that they were talking about before I can report it back to the senator. Because, it's just kind of like a different language to me. Yeah. Because they're all talking engineer talk and things. I'm always like, can you please forward me that slide so I can take better notes?
Yes.
That is one of the things that pops up most, is just working with folks that aren't social workers and trying to learn their language and how we collaborate and really do make a team.
Right. And you're just that's that kind of balance of being in an interdisciplinary type, setting where you're kind of the coordinator of that. And I think social workers are really good at that. So I think that we excel in that area, and that's, kind of a unique skill that we bring to the table too.
Yeah.
Bob, did you have anything to add to this particular question?
Yeah, I just want to add that in addition to, I think what you've heard already is that we do bring a unique value set to the table. I think sometimes I find myself in discussions that in a social work setting wouldn't even be a debate, but it often is a debate. And we were meeting with a pretty powerful House member once, and he said, I don't really care what the clients think about this, and you wouldn't hear one of us say that. I think the second set of skills that we bring, though, that maybe isn't so much macro as clinical. I want to be clear, when I was saying clinical work wore me out, but clinical skills we use all the time. And that's unique. I find myself in macro settings where, to be frank, you're sometimes the only person there with any understanding of how human beings work, and how thinking works, and how speaking works, and how change happens. Seriously. And I think that's something social workers don't prize enough in their own work. They bring something that other disciplines don't bring to the table, that is pretty, and it gives us an advantage in making change happen that doesn't exist from other practices.
I would totally agree with you, Bob, too. I think we just bring a unique way of helping to facilitate those conversations. And you're right, even just our natural way of speaking about, people first is not the general population of who we're interacting with. So that's a really good point. So this kind of leads into the next question. But before I go into the next question, I just wanted to let you know there is a little Q&A in the Q&A box, and it's from Julie Farman, just to say hi to Janlynn and Jameca. I think she was a former instructor for you, so she was excited.
Hi,
she's watching from the sideline.
Actually, the link to my first macro job, the job.
Great. Great. So I just wanted to point that out if you didn't see that in the Q&A.
She was actually calling in to say she has some incomplete grades for the two of you.
That's right. We have to go back to the drawing board.
Too late. The degree has been received.
Okay, so the next question that sort of leads into this next question, and again, this is a really common question from students, is how to balance practicing under the NASW Code of Ethics in a setting where others have a different code of ethics or no professional code of ethics. And I was going to kind of shoot that to Janlynn, because I feel like you probably, again, are exposed to just a lot of different, professions within that. So.
Yeah, so I guess you can say I probably work mostly with a lot of folks that don't have a professional code of ethics. They may have certain policies that they stick to, but trying to balance that, it can be challenging in some ways, again, because we do represent the constituents, the people's voice, and trying to make others understand why we should make decisions or policy changes one way versus another, because it's really what the people want.
Mm-hmm.
So I think operating with the code of ethics kind of, it helps to keep us people focused, people minded, as I think about our legislature right now. Stephanie may be the only social worker in the Michigan legislature. For those of you that didn't know, she has her MSW also from the other school down the street. So we need more social workers in legislation, those of us that understand what people truly need and truly want,
Mm-hmm.
and how to make policies that can really make systemic changes.
Mm-hmm.
So,
for sure.
Yep.
What about the other panelists? Have you had experiences where you've had to come up against professionals that are living or working under a different code of ethics than we follow as licensed social workers?
Let me weigh in if I could.
Yes.
What I like about the preamble of the Code of Ethics of social workers, what it says is ethics are worked out by people with good intent who can work these things out. And that's true within our field and outside our field. So I've been impressed with when you really start to talk to people beyond the disciplines Code of Ethics. Our society has some.
Right.
And different cultures have them, different faiths, different religious backgrounds, different cultural backgrounds. We're always weaving those together. And I think the mistake would always be, of course, to say that our code of ethics trumps yours. Better to say, how do we weave these things together? And I think, we live in a society where you have to say, what's a core belief across disciplines and cultures? And I think those are the ones we hold to. It's amazing how much the code of ethics that we have, though, fits most of the core beliefs that most cultures and most faiths and most political views have.
That's true. That's true. I know there's just been, some anecdotal things that will come out in class sometimes with students, and we'll walk through this, how do you deal with that interpersonally in the workplace? When you have a psychologist maybe that isn't necessarily following the same code of ethics. And so we walk through that. So it's a common question that we have, but I agree with you, Bob. It really is an integrated, situation, and we can help students understand that piece of it as well.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll jump in. I think one of the great things about the Code of Ethics, when you are a macro social worker who's maybe practicing in a setting where you're not working with other social workers on a day-to-day basis, is that it provides a context for macro social work and what your place is at the table. It describes some of those values that we share related to promoting social justice and addressing social problems. And it really helps us stay connected to the profession. It is very easy for social work to be framed at the clinical level, the micro level. And I think it gives all of us macro social workers a context and a way to stay connected.
Yeah, that's a great point, Katie. I agree with that it does kind of help ground us in those things. And we do sometimes focus just on the clinical, but it's important to understand the big picture of that as well.
Kelly, if I could add to Katie's point, is that all right?
Yes.
So I think Katie is right. I think sometimes in the clinical world, if you hang around with social workers only, you're dealing with only a couple of ethics, HIPAA or compliance, or, don't break the privacy or confidentiality, and don't violate the boundaries. But in macro work, we're bumping into ethical frameworks all the time. having, like I always tell people, any decision the social worker makes, especially in the macro field, you're almost always trading off one ethic for another or compromising on two of them, almost always. And getting used to that ambiguity is, I always say, welcome to adulthood. I mean, that's how adult social work works. I mean, I've heard people say, well, it's the wrong thing to do. I say, well, you tell me the right thing in this case and we'll do it. But it almost always has a downside that violates some other ethic.
Yeah. So how have you dealt with or helped students through some of those things? Because I know you are a field instructor for us and you've had many students. You know, have you had specific instances where you've had to help them walk through an ethical decision making?
Yeah, just one this morning, actually. Yeah. I mean, I won't violate that comment.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
But I mean, it's always between the example I give, if you follow the work requirement, Medicaid work requirement law that passed, right? Really a law that actually violates the intent of Medicaid. It adds a work requirement that can eliminate over 100,000 people from Medicaid, right? So you think the ethic would be to fight that. However, I have an obligation to our members and some of the sponsors of that bill in the House and Senate, we need for other issues. So literally, we had to work around that bill, not oppose the bill, but work to water it down so it didn't harm our clients. You might say that's an ethical compromise, and I would say it is. But it was because you needed if we had opposed it, by the way, it wouldn't have stopped the bill from passing. And we would have lost the potential, which we always need, of R&D support for our clients. So that was a great example of that, I think.
Yeah, that is a great example, actually, because it is like you still were able to get some of what you needed for our customer base, but understanding that, you know, it might be a little bit of a, like you said, a watered down version of what you intended, ideally.
Right.
For that. So that's great. That's a really great example. I might bring that to class. Okay, so we have one last kind of structured question about what advice would you give to new macro social work grads about landing their first job related to macro social work? And I was going to throw that out to Bob first, just because I know you've really helped and mentored a lot of students over the past few years. And if you had any advice about how to seek their first job.
I do, Kelly. I think that was just your way of saying, man, are you an old social?
No, I didn't say that. But I know you have helped us with a lot of students.
Yeah, so I always have three bits of advice. It's just funny you would ask this. I have a tattoo that says these three things. So let me give it to you. So the first one is stay in the field. Stay in the field. I hear a lot of macro social workers, they'll get out, and all of us as young MSWs, we think, man, I can really change the world. If they would just give me a job that's powerful enough, well, it ain't going to happen for decades. So stay in the field. I've seen people leave the field because of that. And when I say leave the field, I don't mean stay in a job that's called a social worker. I mean, most of us, actually 4 of us, none of us are called social workers. No. None of the 4 of us on the screen. In fact, even you, Kelly, right? Yeah, all 5 of us.
That's right. That's right.
So you will know that that's your field, but stay in it. Don't leave it and go into some other field. The second one is gain exposure to a wide range of client groups, colleagues, methods, political venues. I mean, really expose yourself to a lot of it, either in the same job, because you can do that if you're open to that, or a bunch of different jobs. And the third is macro practice, in my view, is made up of a lot of things: research, evaluation, political advocacy, community organizing, political action, coalition building. Spend time building each of those skills. No one job will give you all of them, usually, no one project. And I find by doing that, you're building a heck of a resume. And so those are the 3 bits of advice that I give folks, Kelly.
That's a great point, Bob. And I think I kind of follow that same thing. I always say this experience is the next building block to my next experience, and just kind of gathering all of those things as part of, beyond even a resume builder, just building your skills. So I totally agree. Jameca, what about you? What advice would you give new grads?
I think I would pretty much piggyback on, a lot of the things that Bob said. One of the things that when I taught, I've always told my students is that you're always on a job interview. So when you're volunteering for projects or like Bob was mentioning, you're building your skills by doing some of those different things. You're always on a job interview. And those are the things that opens doors to new opportunities and different opportunities. And remember that this is macro social work. So like Bob mentioned, none of us are called social workers on this panel. So sometimes you find the social work in the job and just being open to that. and being open to, you know, finding what you're passionate about, building those skills, making those connections, utilizing all of your resources as far as your people resources. Who do you know? And how can you make those connections? And how can you utilize those connections and turn them into opportunities?
That's great. What about you, Kadi? Do you have any advice?
So I think about this maybe in terms of practicality, in terms of looking for the right jobs. You know, when you graduate and you have that social work degree, you might be applying for jobs where there aren't social workers like we talked about. And so the folks that you're handing your resume to might not really understand the context for why you're there, why you're applying. So you're going to want to be able to articulate some of the skills that you have, that you bring to the table related to engagement with folks, analysis and evaluation of programs and policy, and helping them understand as a macro social worker how you can help advance their organization, the cause that they're working on, help folks in the community. So, you know, you might be looking for positions with the title policy analyst in them, project coordinator, community organizer, and then being able to translate what skills you have, you know, really describing the field placement experience that social workers have. It's a really unique opportunity in your education that you have to have this really in-depth, hands-on learning experience, and to be able to explain to your future employers about what skills you would be bringing as a result of that experience really helps them understand why you as a social worker should have a seat at their table and how you're going to help them advance their mission and cause. And then finally, I would just say, you know, pick a mentor, interview people who are in the field that you want to be working in and talk with them. You know, one thing that I hear on this panel today, and that I hear certainly from a lot of the macro social workers that I work with on a day-to-day basis, is that we all have our unique journeys and how we got here. So, you know, find out where you might start, learn from them how they got to where they are, and, you know, gaining that network of folks that you can reach out to and learn from is so important.
Yes, I agree with the mentorship too. I think a lot of people, when they tell me their stories about how they got to where they were within a social work field, there usually is someone that they've been able to mentor under or partner with, you know, to help them along in that way. Janlynn, do you have any advice? I think you're muted, Janlynn. Oh. Okay, we can, oh, there you are. Yeah.
All right. I don't know what happened. It just all of a sudden was muted.
It's okay.
Yeah. I would say, I mean, everything that the other three panelists have said are great advice. Just to add to it, just listen. Listening to what it is that folks want. That's how we truly make change. And I'll give an example. When I was an intern with Stephanie's office back when she was a rep, listening to seniors, which at first was just a little complaint session about the cost of living rising and they can't afford their rents. After 2 years, it's turned into bill packages around housing bills. So listening to what folks really want and need. I tell the students that I supervise in field placement, we don't want to take our community members apples when they want oranges. So, you know, just listening to what folks want.
Yes, that's great. Another really good example. That's great. So we actually have some open Q&As already queued up in our Q&A box. I don't know if you guys can see those, but I'm looking through them and wanting to kind of pull some out, but there are a couple that really lead into what we were just talking about with regard to, so you have advice for, you know, students and people coming out in the field, but what advice do you have for schools of social work to kind of support and advance macro practice? Like, what do you need from your organizations, from students coming out? And I'll just throw that out to the panel at large.
I think that from the time that I graduated, say undergrad to now, I've been really encouraged, because it seems that when I was in undergrad, we didn't talk about macro social work a lot. But now I'm seeing with some of the local schools that there are classes that are dedicated to macro social work, and those conversations are taking place more and more at that undergrad level. And so that's very encouraging. I feel like that's what we need in this field from the schools, is to be able to have those conversations with students as early as possible so that they can understand what macro social work is, as well as the tie-in. A lot of us talked about, doing micro work and macro work and that tie-in, and, so students can understand that.
Yeah, that's a good idea, introducing it early and kind of providing opportunities and forums for them to ask questions and find out about it. I think that's a great idea. Anybody else have some ideas?
I do have some thoughts, but I think what I'm about to say is going to sound paradoxical, so here goes nothing. So, I think there's sort of a false dichotomy between micro and macro. You probably got that in my comments. And I think to realize that all of us use micro skills, right? Human being skills. Mm-hmm. But all clinical social workers need to be advocates and think of macro. I mean, many micro practitioners also move up the chain of command to become managers. Managers of social works is macro practice, but they often forget that. So that's the one thing about the line is not so clear. It's much fuzzier. However, what I find in higher education, though, is if you have only a few number of macro social workers in a large group of clinical folks, they're treated like a bad minority. They're ostracized. They have to always interpret the micro language. And so I'm a huge believer in developing cohorts of macro and keeping them as cohorts to be taught, even though they're being taught, hopefully, to cross those lines. But there are things that are macro skills that will bore a clinician and vice versa. And to ask one minority to always make interpretations of the majority's, views and culture isn't good learning. So I would recommend both those things.
That's great. And that actually sort of answers, Michael had a question about why advocacy isn't part of both micro and macro practice learning, because we do have to do that, in both micro and macro practice. So I think that was a good question from him as well, and you answered it, Bob, already. So that's helpful. There was
maybe there, Kelly, on that
go ahead,
question
Kadi.
that Michael had asked. It's a great question, and I also would add that as a macro social worker, I love to see our folks in the clinical settings and doing micro social work participating in advocacy efforts. And I know that a lot of membership associations like the Federation will have like an annual legislative day at the Capitol and do a lot of, like what Bob said, connecting folks to their legislators and having them come to Lansing to meet with them. Legislators want to help the people in their communities, and if they're not hearing from them, if they're not hearing from the social workers who are helping to provide services and really understand the depth of those needs of those people, they don't know how to respond and how to be helpful. So it's our job as macro social workers to help facilitate those conversations and to ensure that folks who have that direct experience with families or whoever their constituency is are bringing that voice right to the decision makers as well.
That's great. Does anybody else have any ideas or thoughts about that? There is another question.
I would just like to add, while Kadi was mentioning that there is an NSAW Capital Day, March 19th, for all of us. We should all be present. down at the Capitol, the lobby for social work.
That's a good reminder. I did see that come through. That's great. There was another question, because we've talked, a lot about just our work and what we do, and that we have talked about clinical kind of burning us out. But what about as, even just macro social workers, how do you practice your own self-care? Because social work in general can be a very tiring and kind of a burnout profession.
So I'll say I'm very intentional about self-care. Even when I'm teaching in the classroom, a lot of times I'll make self-care an assignment because I understand the high burnout rate. I make a joke that sometimes I sit back and think, I went to school to deal with other people's problems when I'll have my own to deal with, for the rest of my life. But so I'm very intentional about self-care. I'm very selfish with my me time. I don't spend time that I don't like. I don't spend free time doing things that I don't like to do, or being around negative energy, because I understand I need to recharge. So things that I like to do, whether it's shopping for the weekend or not getting off the couch, whatever I need to do to recharge.
Yeah, that's great.
And I don't apologize for it.
Yeah. Anybody else have some good self-care tips for social workers in general?
I might throw a couple in there. I mean, one I find helpful is to frame the time span that our work works in. You can really get burned out if you think, by this summer, we're going to do whatever, right? In our work, I gave a lecture to a bunch of younger social activists saying, I hope you're buckling in for 30 years, not just this summer. And I think if you have that mindset, and you don't hope it takes 30 years, you hope poverty is gone this week, right? But
yes,
if you have that mentality, you'll burn out pretty quickly. And I've seen a lot of people go from being very progressive to being very conservative quickly because of that. And I guess the second one is to have a lot of friends that you can commiserate with and get energy from, who are either in the field or even who aren't in the field, but who care about some of the issues that you do.
Right. That's great. That's good advice. What about Kadi and Janlynn? Any ideas that you can share?
I kind of try to schedule at least quarterly, like a day off, where I just sit in front of the TV and catch up on all the junk TV that I want to, and just kind of, block everything out. And that's probably the only day that I don't check emails. I just took a vacation and was getting fussed at because I was checking emails. But, at least once a quarter, I try to say, you know what, I'm not coming in today. I'll see you guys tomorrow. So.
Yeah, I think that's great. And maybe I'll just say that, we all have different strategies of what we enjoy in our time to ourselves and self-care. But I think what I hear as a theme is maybe that boundary of making sure that you have, a structured day off that you're conscious about, or that you understand the parameters of your work. I take my Saturdays very seriously. That's a day for my family, my kids, friends, and things like that. So whatever boundary you need to set up to make sure that you're giving yourself space between your personal and professional life, I think is you have to find ways to enjoy that time in between. Because we can all be really passionate about what we do, but we have to make sure that we're passionate about taking care of ourselves as well.
Right. That's true. And that's great. I agree. I think we aren't good about that. And I talk about it with students already before they've even graduated about the need to make sure you have that time for yourself. Okay, so there's 2 more questions, and we are still open for questions. And, if we get done a little early, we get done a little early. But these 2 questions are actually kind of related. And actually, there's 3 questions kind of related to each other, all regarding skill development. So they're asking, what you feel like your most important or beneficial skill that you've developed so far that's really helped you in your work. And then what skill do you wish that you would develop a little further, like that maybe you have and need to continue to learn and develop? Bob, do you want to start with that?
Yeah, my head was down because I was jotting down the answers to these questions because I want to do really good on this test. So I guess there's 4 or 5 of them. Some are sort of like mindsets and some are skills. One of them is to know how to read people, really read them, not just what they tell you. I mean, a great social work skill, but also one that I think a lot of micro social workers don't pick up is how to read the room. In other words, when you're done with the dialogue prior to the meeting and afterwards, you can say, I know where the center of gravity was. Nobody voted on it. Nobody wrote it down. But you say, I know if I came back next time and said, I think we were saying this, everybody would nod. I think important skill. I call it the center of gravity because it's not always well spoken, but if you're good at this, right, we all get good at this, you can pick it up. Because I've walked out of rooms where people can't and they say, oh, all they did was fight. And I said, no, they didn't. They agreed on this. It was clear they were agreeing. Yeah. Second, I think another one is project management skills. People expect us to do that, sort of the left brain stuff, which people don't tend to prize, but to make it organized and get the work done. Grant writing's critical. If you're going to get a job, I think grant writing and evaluation and research skills. I mean, not PhD level, but the ability to ask a question in a way that elicits the answer.
Yeah.
And then I'd say budgeting, to know how budgets work and how fiscal, even though, some social workers are inappropriately number phobic. They really need to stop that. But because if you keep saying that the CFO is going to run the show and the social worker won't.
Yeah.
So, and then organizational behavior, to understand it and be able to modify it and change it. Those are the ones I would recommend.
Yeah, and I agree with you on all these fronts, especially even just being able to look at a financial report and understand what they mean. I will bring to class oftentimes like examples of, Walmart's financial report and tell me what you see here. What does it look like or whatever. And it's scary. They kind of put their blinders up, or they get concerned, that they don't understand budgets, or they don't understand numbers, or they never thought. I know I didn't go to graduate school, and I'm an MSU grad as well, we didn't talk about budgets at all, and I never thought I was going to be working with budgets as much as I do. It's kind of a surprise when you get into the work that you do have to be aware of that, even at a micro level. You might be sitting on a committee as a clinician and have to look at budget reports and being familiar and comfortable with that. But all the other things are important as well. What about the rest of the panel? Do you have some ideas about skills that you wish that you had learned, or things that you would want students to know coming out of graduate school?
I think knowing how your legislature works, and not just your state. Mm-hmm. Local is very, 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 very important. We partner with a city council member here in Detroit, and it's just amazing how those issues, like local issues, are really like most of what we handle compared to a state level. So I encourage everyone to understand how your local, state, and federal legislation works, how you can reach out to elected officials. And I'd even encourage you to just contact your senator's office. Just get some practice in it, and how to communicate with elected officials, because you might find yourself on boards, committees, or whatnot that you're going to need to have that interaction in the future.
That's great. That's a good tip as well.
And the importance of federal policy, laws, things like those impact, the services that we provide every single day.
Yes, that's so true. What about you, Kadi? Did you have any last minute tips and skills that you'd like to see students come out with?
So I think in the macro social work setting, the budgets and understanding how the legislature work is really something that I was not exposed to before I left school, and was something I was certainly thrown into in my job. And just learning the lingo of the legislature, what does it mean? What is the difference between shall and may when you talk about a law that you're looking at? What does that impact? How to understand the bottom line of a budget, and then where to find the information on how a certain program has been funded in the past. So just really learning how to navigate those intricacies of what we do as social workers is something I didn't have a whole lot of practice in my schooling, that I think would be something that you're going to find yourself, no matter if you're in a legislative setting or not, you're going to be looking up that information.
Right. Yes, and I would agree. And it's funny because I do talk about that in class as well. Like, even if you think it's boring and you don't want to know how this is, how this organization is funded, it's important to know, because when there's changes in legislation about funding, it could affect that funding coming down to your organization where you work, and then it kind of hits home more about job security and those types of things. So I totally agree. Well, that's the last question that we have, and we're actually almost to 1 o'clock. So I think that we're going to probably wrap it up here. Thank you so much to the panelists. I really appreciate it. It was kind of fun talking to you in this forum. I like being in person, but this was actually very nice and easy to do. So we appreciate all your time, and we hope that we'll see you soon in the future. And like I said, when at the beginning, we will be transferring this into an online link that we'll send out to the listserv, and we'll make sure that the panelists also receive it. But if anyone is on here and wants to receive that and doesn't think they're going to get it through a listserv, just let us know, at the school social work, and we can get it to you. So we appreciate all the time that people devoted for today, and we're hoping that this was helpful to people that were logged into the webinar.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thanks. We're getting lots of comments that it's been very helpful, so that's good.
Great.
Thanks so much, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.